Right now we're going to turn our attention to broaden our introduction to the idea of the responsibility to protect, and we're delighted to have some really distinguished guests here to talk about the efforts in their particular areas of expertise. Here to moderate the panel, I am very pleased to introduce Professor Jerry Sanders, who's the chair of the Peace and Conflict Studies Department here at UC Berkeley. It's part of International and Area Studies. He's also a lecturer in that department. You have the full bios of the panelists available, but Professor Sanders will introduce them briefly before we turn to their remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Camille. Peace and Conflict Studies is both a major and a minor here at UC Berkeley. For those of you who did not know that, several of the students are out there today, and they certainly are quite familiar with responsibility to protect. Shortly after I was introduced to the responsibility to protect in early 2002, I began to incorporate it into my classes, where it's been a staple since, in its various iterations. Students have found it to be several things: a source of inspiration, certainly an intellectual anchor in troubled times, and as they seek to understand the world such as it is, it certainly provided a very important framework. In addition, they found it to be an excellent source of material for final exams. Well, as I said, since 2001, there have been several iterations toward its culmination as a declaratory principle in 2005, and several people that have been involved in this process, along with Gareth Evans. And we are fortunate here today to have four of them with us on this quartet, key architects who have been engaged in the, both in terms of the principles as well as moving from principle to practice, which is our charge here today. As Gareth Evans and Romain Dallaire have urged in their inspirational calls to action both last night and this morning, the importance here of moving these norms into actual practice. So we have with us people who are engaged in that. The first of our speakers will be, to my near left, Richard Cooper. Richard Cooper is convener of the R2P Coalition. Mr. Cooper is a member of the board of the Chicago Council of Global Affairs, and he serves on its executive committee. He's also a member of the International Advisory Council on the International Crisis Group. And the Division of Labor here will be, Mr. Cooper will speak primarily about the civil society framework and the promise and potential of coalition building and efforts to get municipalities to sign on to R2P. I'm going to just, these are very spare biographies of people with illustrious backgrounds and enormous degree of experience, and since you have that before you, I'll just hit the high notes. Ramesh, our second speaker, has served as Vice Rector and Senior Vice Rector of the United Nations University. He's also been Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations from 1998 to 2007. He was also a Commissioner and one of the principal authors of the Responsibility to Protect, and Senior Advisor on Reforms and Principal Writer of the United Nations Secretary General Kofi Annan's Second Reform Report in 2002. He is the author of several books, most recently, The United Nations, Peace and Security, From Collective Security to the Responsibility to Protect, which also carries it forward by Gareth Evans. Our third speaker on the panel is Heidi Hulan. She's counselor and head of the political section at the Canadian Permanent Mission to the United Nations. In 2000, Ms. Hulan joined the Department of Foreign Affairs as Deputy Director of the Commission on Intervention in State Sovereignty, which was the blue ribbon panel that produced the Responsibility to Protect. Following this, she was named coordinator of Canada's diplomatic strategy in support of the Responsibility to Protect, and was subsequently named director of the Peacebuilding and Human Security Division, serving as lead Canadian negotiator on R2P and the Peacebuilding Commission. She would be speaking about her experience on the diplomatic front and how to move that forward. Steve Crawshaw, our final speaker in the series, in this first of panels, of all-day panels, for those of you who don't know. He will Steve joined Human Rights Watch as London Director in 2002 and became the organization's UN Advocacy Director in 2006. Before joining Human Rights Watch, he worked for many years as a journalist with The Independent, including as German bureau chief. His most recent book is Easier Fatherland, Germany in the 21st Century. Mr. Crawshaw will be outlining the challenges and ways to overcome those obstacles and challenges to the implementation of R2P. So each panelist will speak for an outrageously short opening statement of only 10 minutes on subjects that could easily take several days. After that, each panelist will have an opportunity to respond to what others have said. Then we'll get to the Q&A period, and you will, of course, want to keep your questions short and to the point to maximize the possibilities of participation. So please give our audience a warm welcome. Audience, excuse me, panelists.
The audience as well.
Thank you, Jerry. It's an honor to be here at Berkeley. You know, by the time you get to be 67 years old, I wonder where have I been for the last 45 years. 45 years ago, people at Berkeley were talking about stopping wars. And I guess 45 years later, we're still talking about stopping wars. The more things change, the more they remain the same. But we have an opportunity at hand with the responsibility to protect doctrine, which was, while it was adopted by the General Assembly in 2005, was only adopted by the Security Council on April 28th of 2006. So the doctrine is not even a year old. So for those of you who are sitting here wondering about how the history of the rest of your life is going to play out, you're going to play a very important role in the 21st century because you're going to be seeing the manifestation of this doctrine and potentially peace on earth. So let me start by firstly thanking Camille Crittenden for inviting me and for doing this wonderful job of putting this conference together. This is the first participation on the part of the public. I had a conference in Chicago that was kind of an insider's game to discuss and decide what some of the elements of the responsibility to protect doctrine should be, so that the political extremists wouldn't get a hold of it before considered people were able to define it or help to define it. And that's very much what I hope we'll be able to get today from what we say and what you say. So I'm looking forward to the whole conference. The issue that I had when I came across this doctrine at putting together a conference originally at the Chicago Council on intervention was I was directed to this Canadian conference on sovereignty and intervention, and I thought that was wonderful. But the report was the responsibility to protect, which Gareth pointed out to you. And I kept reading this doctrine, which I had never heard of. And I said, my God, this is historic. This changes everything. It changes the way we think about sovereignty, and it changes the way we think about each other. And that doctrine says, which is now embedded at the United Nations, that we are our brother's keepers. And this is a wonderful, wonderful new philosophy. But it is actually embedded in as a global norm now. So what does that mean to America? America is at one of the lowest points in our moral authority in the world, as you all know and feel. And I believe this doctrine can help us reassert our moral authority, first for ourselves, because we need to be doing the right things in the world and helping people. And as I began to talk to people at the United Nations, I was told nothing happens without America's support. Nothing good will get done by any of these committees or things that are going on in the United Nations without America's support. And up to now, in the last 12 years, we haven't had that kind of support to make things happen. So here's this new doctrine that needs to be considered very carefully because it's in its nascent stage. My job as the coalition convener was to try and think through America's role in bringing R2P forward. And I tried to think of all of the issues of the moral community in designing what I hope is a solution that would truly end genocide, because the end is potentially at hand. We need to do a few things. Firstly, the American people do not know about R2P. But everybody that has heard this doctrine is moved to want to join, is moved to want to do something or tell somebody or inform somebody about it, because it does mean a lot once you realize that there is something to be done here. So I started to think through what I could do, and I realized that in a democracy, our political leaders don't act unless there's grassroots political support. So I tried to see what kind of support I would get, and I went to the mayor of Chicago and I told him about this doctrine, and he immediately said, you know, I'd like to pass a resolution at the city council endorsing this and do it as a petition to the federal government to let them know that the people of the city of Chicago are embracing R2P as a norm. And then we went to the state legislature in Illinois, and we got the head of the House and the Senate to pass a joint resolution petitioning our federal government, the President, the leaders of the House and the Senate, and the Defense Department and the Department of State to embrace the responsibility to protect as a norm. And then we thought, gee, wouldn't this be wonderful to take around the 50 states? Now, this was before the elections in 2000, in November, and we were facing a Republican administration that we really wanted to petition. We held our conference in a week after the election, but everything has changed with the potential of bringing things forward. So we engaged the moral community in Chicago, the Metropolitan Council of Churches, and we got them to endorse the responsibility to protect doctrine. And then we got the National Council of Churches to endorse the R2P doctrine. And they have taken up the cause of R2P and are going to bring it to their membership all over the country and to get their mayors and state legislatures to pass and endorse the responsibility to protect doctrine. So some of the real hard work now is being spread out amongst organizations that are finding their own voice in the responsibility to protect doctrine. This doctrine belongs to all of us, not to Gareth Evans or Dick Cooper or any of the panel members. It belongs to everybody. So wherever your heart might move you to act on the campus or in your courses or with other organizations that you're involved in, feel free to do so. The responsibility calls on us individually to act and to really accept our own individual responsibility in these regards. I hear the voices of untold millions of people that were asking for help and have been turned away by our government. The situation in Darfur, and the situation, the atrocity that happened in Rwanda, the structure of the United Nations in regard to individual states is not structured for success when it comes to genocides. When 800,000 people can be killed in 100 days, the head of state knows that the international community can't work fast enough to address those situations. And this is the same thing in Darfur. There's 400,000 people that are already been killed, and they're still negotiating with them, and they're still killing people. So the wonderful thing about the responsibility to protect doctrine is that it holds the head of state responsible. For the first time in history, the head of state can no longer hide behind the shield of sovereignty, and is now in effect, no head of state and no man is above the law. So when I started to look at the language that is being used by the international community in defining crimes against humanity, crimes, human rights violations. These are all crimes, and these are atrocity crimes. And I said, why, if R2P came into being by changing the way we look at states' rights and shifted the lens and look at states' responsibilities, why can't we stop thinking of intervention in terms of military intervention, and why can't we think on a new paradigm? Instead of ad hoc responses, instead of interventions, and instead of using the military, why don't we think of a justice solution? I think that the next important application of the responsibility to protect doctrine is having the United States join the International Criminal Court. No country is above the law. No man is above what I see playing out in this century as the global rule of law. Not military intervention, judicial empowerment. And one of the things that's missing from the doctrine is an enforcement mechanism. So I'm calling on the international community and our political leaders also to endorse the idea of having an international marshal service at the behest of the Security Council that works in coordination with the International Criminal Court, so that when indictments are handed out, just as they have been on a number of Ugandan generals, that they can be served, and that these perpetrators of these incredible crimes, I have other names, these perpetrators of these atrocity crimes can be brought to justice through the justice system, a global rule of law, not military action. America will probably not be willing to intervene in these situations for a long time to come. And that, I think, if there's any good that's coming out of the Iraq war, is that that is not the way. So speaking on behalf of the more than 100 million people that have been killed in genocides in this past century, I ask you to join in this great moral cause and help us stop and relegate atrocity crimes to something that happened in the 20th century, not in the 21st century.
To navigate my way without falling off there. Let me begin from where Dick ended. Gareth talked about the 1990s being a defining decade for our commission work, and then the adoption in 2005 fall by the World Summit meeting at the UN. Take that as your bookends in time. In 1990, no tyrant would have had cause to fear being called to international account for exercising his license to kill. 1990. 2005. No leader anywhere in the world can be confident of sovereign impunity anymore. Not anyone. I do not exclude the country I'm in. 15 years is a very short time in the broad sweep of history for such a dramatic transformation of the international criminal landscape. Please bear that in mind. Now, we do have an outrageously short time. I'd like to begin and end with a poem. The first one is very well known, probably to all of you. The second one less so. In between, I'll say some other things as well. The first one, The Second Coming, Yet. I'm sorry I cannot mimic the lovely Irish accent. I wish I could. But let me just read out the relevant part. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Ladies and gentlemen, this is what the Commission was about, to harness the passionate conviction of the best, like Romeo Dallaire and Gareth Evans, and I've known and worked with Gareth for many years now, and harness that commitment and conviction to the betterment of humanity. There's a number of background factors which led us to that. The increasingly internationalized human conscience, the tremendous growth in the human rights movement, the International Humanitarian Law Convention, the Genocide Convention, the change in the nature of warfare that Romeo Dallaire talked about, from huge mechanized armies of uniformed soldiers to irregulars using light weapons, the shift from interstate to, I don't even like civil wars or intrastate wars anymore. We're talking about shift from interstate really to borderless armed violence on a continuum that goes from the village community and becomes transregional. The increasing rate of civilians being killed. More importantly, the change where civilians have become the direct targets of warfare and violence. The increasing numbers of civilians being killed through starvation and disease. But this has not been accompanied by a matching globalization in the process of international policy making. And all that has led to what we called implicitly, and the high-level panel made much more explicit, a gap between lawfulness and legitimacy. That which is legally permitted may not meet all the contingencies. And if the outcome is unjust, support for the legal system itself will evaporate. Then we will risk the double anarchy of chaos and violence concerning mainly civilians within countries, domestically, and the absence of a rules-based legal order that is predictable and stable, and we know where we stand internationally. And the responsibility to protect doctrine is a way of bridging that gap, of harnessing our conviction, of recognizing common humanity, but also a way of bridging the gap between principles and action. At the same time, I would like you to bear in mind that much of the developing countries' attitude to this is not unreasonable. There is a history behind that. The book that was referred to, let me just read you one paragraph, a brief extract from that, in which I said that if I was to try to communicate and provide an explanation for the sense of equally passionate conviction that many developing countries have on major issues in relation to the use of force overseas by the West, this is what I would say. They, the European colonizers, came to liberate us, the colonial natives, from our local tyrants and stayed to rule as benevolent despots. In the name of enlightenment, they defiled our lands, plundered our resources, and expanded their empires. Some, like the Belgians in the Congo, left only ruin, devastation, and chaos, whose dark shadows continue to blight. Others, like the British in India, left behind ideas, ideals, and structures of good governance and infrastructure of economic development, alongside memories of national humiliation. Should they be surprised that their fine talk of humanitarian intervention translates in our consciousness into efforts to resurrect and perpetuate rule by foreigners? That we look for the ugly reality of geostrategic and commercial calculations camouflaged in lofty rhetoric? Should we be mute accomplices when they substitute their mythology of humanitarian intervention for our narratives of colonial oppression? Do they think we do not remember or do not care? Or is it simply that they themselves do not care? That historical baggage is very real and has a good basis for it. Iraq is but the latest manifestation of that. So please remember that. Having said that, we engaged in extensive outreach, exercise, and consultations at all levels, from government leaders to civil society, in every continent. I keep saying, and I'll say it to you, in the year 2001, I spent more time with Gareth and with Heidi here than I did with my wife. She was my other woman for that year. Nowhere did we encounter an absolute rejection of intervention. Nowhere. In all consultations, people were prepared to concede that sometimes outsiders may indeed have to step in with military force to protect innocent civilians from perpetrators of mass killings and ethnic cleansing. And yet, most interlocutors expressed reservations regarding the term humanitarian, saying there is too much baggage. So we redefined responsibility, we substituted humanitarian with R2P. In all consultations, people emphasized the importance of the United Nations. Developing countries are unanimously opposed to non-UN authorized Western interventions. And all parts of the world are seriously concerned with issues of double standards and selectivity. We took that on board, and it is reflected in the responsibility to protect. In the full report, you will find the various caveats and qualifications, and the precautionary principles in particular. So when we explain what we actually have in R2P, people's opposition does begin to decline. And they accept the reality. And the analogy I like to use is the medical one. We have tremendously improved surgical techniques and instruments. Along with this have come new questions of ethics, law, morality. Simply accepting a parent's decision is no longer enough. We had the Terry Schiavo case here. A couple of months ago, 1 month ago, I think we had a case in British Columbia and Canada where parents were being forced to were being taken to court by the government for not using available medicine. We've had similar things in Japan. Simply standing by and doing nothing is no longer enough. We have to respond. And what R2P does is to ensure that there are rules-based criteria, so that the intervention is rules-based, not ad hoc. It's multilateral, not unilateral. And it is consensual, not divisive and very polemical. It seems to me much of the opposition, or from the start I thought some of the strongest opposition would in fact actually come from the United States. Why? Because of two things. One, it will constrain them from intervening when they don't want to, when they want to, because they don't meet the precautionary principles. So it may stop them. Two, equally important, it adds to the imperative to do something when they may not want to, because in fact the threshold criteria and the precautionary principles are met. So it has advantages to both sides. Let me finish, as I said, with the other point. And this is from Oscar Wilde, The Ballad of Reading Jail. We did not dare to breathe a prayer or give our anguish scope. Something was dead in each of us, and what was dead was hope. Ladies and gentlemen, R2P is about giving back hope to those who have every reason to have abandoned it. Hope that their lives can and will be made better. Hope that, yes, we the outsiders do care. Hope that, yes, we the outsiders will do something about our care. Translate that into meaningful, effective action. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Can people hear me if I speak from my seat? Thank you, Ramesh. I think that's the first time you've publicly referred to me as your other woman. I don't encourage it in the future. But ladies and gentlemen, they say the good life requires both poetry and plumbing. Ramesh has just given you the poetry, and I'm going to try to give you some plumbing today. Let me start by thanking Camille and the other organizers. Any Canadian who finds themselves in California in March is exuberantly grateful. And also, I'm very grateful because I think this is a very important event and one of what I hope will be many more like it in the future. I'm going to focus my remarks in three areas. One, what is the status of this agenda at the UN? Second, what are the prospects for the agenda in the UN and what is at stake? And third, what is it going to take the aspirational norms articulated in R2P and turn them into practical reality? Heading into the summit, largely due to the efforts of Gareth and many others in this room, one of the basic framing questions for leaders was this: can we protect people when they need it most, when they're confronted by the worst threats to their security, genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity? And if not, in what sense can you really say that there is such a thing as an international community? I'd like to talk a little bit about what exactly it is that we agreed to at the summit, since I think the language in this document takes us a little bit beyond the letter and the confines of the Blue Book. It is wordy text, Gareth. Not unnecessarily wordy text. I would say that it was exactly as wordy as it had to be in order for us to reach agreement on it. Going into the summit, we knew that addressing the unsolved foreign policy challenge presented by Rwanda and Srebrenica would require the establishment of the new norm articulated in R2P, namely qualified sovereignty in relation to the big three crimes: genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity. We also knew that this norm would need to be constructed in such a way that it could serve as a practical policy tool for the Security Council, one with an evidence-based trigger and embraced directly by the Security Council in its own resolutions. On these counts, the outcome document largely succeeds. It protects the basic norm outlined in R2P, asserting qualified sovereignty, but rooting that in the idea of sovereign responsibility vested first and foremost in the state, and then vesting the international community with an ancillary responsibility to act when the state doesn't. Summit outcome moves the debate beyond the responsibility to protect report in one important respect. You'll recall that R2P refers to international action when a state is unwilling or unable to protect its population. The outcome document text that we drafted reformulates this slightly to refer to a manifest failure to protect the population. That's both a semantic and a substantive shift. The problem with the original R2P language was that it requires a subjective judgment about the intentions of the government or other actors involved in the perpetration of crimes. That subjective judgment of inability or unwillingness are essentially unprovable, not to mention politically loaded. Some document opens the door to a more evidence-based assessment of what's happening on the ground. Are people suffering from or from the threat or actual perpetration of the big three? You can see it, you can talk about it, you can quantify it, you can present evidence to the Council. Since the Summit Outcomes Security Council, as others have noted, have made a reference indirectly to R2P by referencing the outcome document, that's equally important because it gives a toehold, as Gareth said, in the Council and sets the stage for certain parts of the operationalization of this agenda. And what's the significance of those developments? The universal adoption and endorsement of the two paragraphs in the outcome document is really a weighty political achievement, The evidence-based trigger that's implied, the toehold in the Security Council, these things have a more than hortatory value. They give us something that has potential practical utility that is new. What's new exactly? Let me just say that since the mid-90s, there's been, as others, notably Victoria Holt in the room have noted, there's been a growing body of practice related to the protection of civilians in armed conflict and civil conflict, one that was preceded by a very recognizable normative shift in the form of the Security Council's actions on protection of civilians. But while vital to the practice of protecting civilians, lessons learned so far could really only be applied in cases where a decision to act has been taken. But what about the decision itself? How do you guide your choices in that situation? Gareth Evans has repeatedly, over many years, talked about the lack of policy tools at the Council's disposal in such situations, and the summit language and subsequent events gives us a toehold to maybe improve that. That's the good news. The bad news is that there's substantial buyer's remorse regarding the summit language and future steps by the Security Council. You'll hear denials that our responsibility to protect language in the summit outcome are universally agreed. I would just note that the ambassador of Egypt told the Security Council not 2 weeks ago that the idea was not yet agreed. So further normative work is necessary. The second is that a recognition of the responsibility to protect in the summit document does not quite equal an acceptance of the responsibility to act. It falls just short of that, in fact. We agree about the general principle, but we disagree about its applicability in certain cases. The second thing I'd like to talk to you about today is the potential of R2P as a new global norm. I think you've heard the positive. If we take implementation of this idea in the summit agreement on R2P seriously, the dividend is enormous. Protection of civilians through effective conflict prevention for the first time, effective response to acute crises when prevention fails, and the promise of effective peace building post-conflict. But on the flip side, the risks of not moving forward are enormous. The truth is that there's a lot of intellectual work that remains. The norm doesn't mean anything yet. The hortatory use has some deterrent effect, but R2P has yet to save any lives. So the humanitarian stakes of not moving this agenda forward are enormous. The diplomatic stakes are equally grave. If we don't take this idea and operationalize it. The truth is that multiple slow burn crises, such as Darfur, or just one fast burn genocide like Rwanda, would devastate the foundations of collective security and confidence in the system of collective security embodied in the UN. Even countries like mine, who have a deep and abiding attachment to the UN, are caused to question its relevance if it cannot respond to these kinds of crimes. And I think that it will also encourage unilateralism if we can't be effective. What's it going to take? 3 things, very briefly. I agree with the categorization that Gareth presented this morning. I think holding the normative line and also norm building. We need to deepen normative consensus on this file. We need to address chronic political concerns that have been raised regarding R2P. If we do it properly, we'll make it harder, not easier, to define as humanitarian conflicts and interventions that are in reality geostrategically motivated. Second, we need to improve monitoring and targeted Security Council advocacy. This includes strengthening existing resources like the Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide, and I see that Juan Mendez has arrived. Welcome. It also means getting serious about mediation at the UN and in our national governments. And finally, it means making the Peace Building Commission effective. Peace Building Commission is the vehicle for post-conflict reconstruction. We need to take that very, very seriously. However, we also need to recognize that prevention and mediation may not always deter an actor with genocidal or intent or otherwise intends to make civilian deaths their direct war aim. And so we need to develop those coercive tools for responding to crises when prevention fails. This includes sanctions enforcement, as well as other non-military enforcement provisions at the Council's disposal. And it also means equipping our militaries with the doctrine, training, and knowledge to deal with protection tasks they're given. I thought General Dallaire was very powerful last night when he asked 3 questions. Do you kill a child who kills? How do you feed 3 million people twice a day when they're dispersed inconveniently? How do you create conditions that permit aid agencies to do what they're there to do? Those are the very difficult questions that militaries face on the ground. They need to be answered. The reality is that our militaries are not equipped, trained, or knowledgeable enough about how to handle those decisions. We need to take that task seriously at all levels. I'd like to end on an optimistic note. think many of us are frustrated by the time it takes to put a norm into effect, and Darfur is a really painful reminder of how far we have to go to match our actions with our values. Be frustrated with that. It's the right thing to do, but also know that the practical challenges we face are solvable, and know that the normative work that has already been done in this area has had an enormous effect. General Dallaire mentioned last night that the Security Council has passed the right kind of Chapter 7 resolution on Darfur. There are enormous challenges to its implementation, but it's worth noting that in the early 1990s, a real option for the Security Council would have been to do nothing. It would have been to pass no resolution or pass inadequate resolutions along the lines of what we saw in the case of Rwanda. Now, the existence of that resolution will be cold comfort if we can't actually protect people there, but my point is that the international community is moving very quickly and can't be deterred by failures. We need to stay the course. At the end of the day, be impatient in the immediate term, but patient over the long term, because if we fail in Darfur and it takes 25 years to fully implement this norm, it will still have been worth it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's a great privilege to be here at the conference. It's also, I have to say, both a privilege and a bit of a challenge, having heard so much powerful and substantive, both substantive but also engaging, the enormous moral and emotional, moral problems that confront us and have confronted us. And we've had so many powerful things both from General Dallaire yesterday and today. So some of which I will say will partly be echoing, but for those here who are just here for the public day, I would echo also what others have said, that this is more than just a talking shop. Sometimes conference is just seen as a talking shop. It is the concern of each of us who's present at this conference in taking it forward. This is actually, tomorrow's sessions especially, but today partly, is a brainstorming, because we have to take it forward from these very nice words to get to reality. And I know that all of us are concerned, and I think that there is no question that it can be done. Echoing partly that what we heard from a couple of speakers earlier, the phrase that many of you will know, the old phrase, all that is needed for evil to triumph is for good men to stand by and do nothing. It is so true, it has been so true in recent years, and it remains so true even as we see what is unfolding today. But on the optimistic side, picking up on what Ramesh was saying earlier about how much things have changed in just the past 15 years. In other words, don't just think, oh, it can't be done. Each of us can see, if we stop to think, how much has changed. And picking up on the panel of change which he referred to, I remembered a meeting that I had, one of the most memorable meetings of my life, actually, for a series of reasons, with Slobodan Milosevic in the summer of 1992. I was a journalist at that time, and the horrors of the Balkans, which he had unleashed, had already begun in Croatia and already in Bosnia. And the very, very first whisperings of some kind of accountability were then beginning to be murmured. There'd just been a conference in London which went absolutely nowhere, not least, frankly, because of the British government of that day didn't really want it to go anywhere. But there were the first murmurings of some kind of accountability. And so I was sitting with Milosevic in his hotel room where he forced the whiskey on me, and I have to say, I did say no several times. It became clear that this was a battle of wills, that I should have the whiskey, so I took the whiskey. We then talked about or I addressed some of the crimes that had been committed, and the fact that there was now a suggestion of accountability, people could be brought to account. And he said, yes, he thought this was an absolutely marvellous idea, this was so important, very, very important. And I was a little bit taken aback by this and said, well, yes, but, some people, Mr. President, suggest that me, absolutely not. Not only was he entirely innocent, but frankly within him, which he clearly was not, but clearly in his head, and we both thought it at that time, it was unreal. It simply wasn't going to go anywhere. People could have nice words, but frankly, nothing was going to go anywhere at all. And in reality, so much changed on that. And then the International Criminal Court, Bill Pace, who's here today, but many others, who again made something which was quite unthinkable become real. And now we have with R2P, the ICC is fine on the back end, if you like, to some extent can be preventive, but fundamentally is about bringing people to account. And R2P and making it real can absolutely be at the other end, not, of course, just to the response, but also in the preventative and in the rebuilding later. So just on some of the difficulties which we need to be honest, it isn't clearly, you know, a kind of a bright new day just there in front of us and there for the grasping. In a sense, it's there for the grasping, but not easily so. Some of the obstacles, Heidi already referred to the buyer's remorse. Indeed, the government's signing off on things and then not really meaning it is a huge problem which we need to address. But I like to think of it as the eternal optimist, as a human rights activist one has to be, that one can see it as a kind of reverse complement to the power of R2P, that people are frightened by what it could mean and are desperately backing off. So what we need to do is to make sure that it becomes very difficult to back off from the things which are already powerfully down there on the printed page in some of the speeches, but which need a lot more. Frankly, the UN in the past 60 years is full of documents which look very nice on paper and went absolutely nowhere. The difference is making it something which does go somewhere. A second element on that, which I really hope will move forward, but is incredibly important and frankly extremely damaging if it does not, is in the Secretary-General's office himself. As we all know, the Secretary-General is one of those, a rather amorphous job. It's sometimes said, is it Secretary or is it General? Is it the Chief Administrative Officer or something else? The job has changed so much over the years, but taking what we were left with most recently, Kofi Annan, who had shown so clearly what moral power can do and moral determination to force things through, that although his actual power is actually very difficult to describe, the authority of the Secretary-General is enormous. But it needs engagement. Kofi Annan was enormously engaged in this. I very, very, very much hope that Ban Ki-moon, the new Secretary-General, will be equally engaged to make sure this doesn't just get stuck in a siding somewhere, because that is clearly the danger. I have to say that some of the conversations that I have had with those in the Secretariat on the 38th floor and the Secretary-General's floor have left me a little bit dismayed that we are back into the old think, which goes, oh, I know, but we've got lots of really pressing problems at the moment, so can we deal with the pressing problems rather than these big philosophical things which move us forward, which you know, sound very nice, but what do they really mean? In reality, of course, that has been precisely the source of the problem so many times before, is that people will only look. Clearly, the breaking crises need to be looked at very urgently now also. But if you think, therefore, you don't look at the bigger picture, then you're actually moving yourself backwards. Iraq, clearly an enormous problem, frankly. Not only is it an enormous problem for Iraq and the rest of the world in many ways, but in the narrow frame of this conference, it makes it difficult that the idea of other countries being concerned and taking action about what is happening in country X over there has frankly become poisoned. And I think all of those who want R2P to succeed need to confront that absolutely up front, that in many ways that whole idea of humanitarian intervention, which interlinks with at least one part of R2P, that has poisoned things very much. And I thought Gareth Evans' phrase is absolutely right. The false friends you described earlier, when you get the leaders of the coalition who moved into Iraq saying, yes, 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 we love R2P, and suggesting that everything that happened in Iraq is part of that. No, because precisely it needs to be part of that continuum. That is what R2P is about. It's a continuum of action. It's not simply a unilateral flicking of fingers without concern for the considerations that come later. But, which I will come to in a moment, there are certainly ways of turning that around, and again, for hopes for R2P rather than the other way. The other one on the obstacles that I find dismaying, as described earlier, I've only recently arrived doing UN work. Before I was London Director of Human Rights Watch, and before that working in a quite different area, well, still on human rights issues, but as a journalist. But arriving at the UN, the turf battles are truly extraordinary and really dismaying. You have turf battles in every bureaucracy, but certainly if we see one bit of the UN saying, oh no, R2P, that's our baby, and another bit of the UN saying, no, no, well really that should be ours, another bit said, no, I think really we'll understand that it belongs with us. Each of those people is wrong in their own different way. And what they need to be doing is working out how they can best work with all the other bits of the UN, and then beyond that with the rest of the international community in moving things forward. So in terms of how we can confront, in a sense, it's just the flip side of what I've described as some of the obstacles. The first is the sense that it shouldn't be turned into a north versus south thing. Anybody who tries to do that, anyone who from the north starts presenting it in that way, oh, don't worry, we'll come and sort you out, has completely got the wrong idea to start with. That's not what it's about. Just as the ICC, the International Criminal Court, one of its key strengths has been its southern strengths as well. This is not some kind of idea of Westerners coming in and pointing fingers and bringing accountability. Those southern countries, South Africa, also Latin American countries which went through such terrible things of their own, those are the countries which have played a really important role. This should not be about outsiders. And like with ICC, it is, of course, only a last resort. The US government, among others, constantly forgets that and thinks the ICC will come pointing and dragging Donald Rumsfeld to a court at the first opportunity. Leaving aside the pluses and minuses of that for one moment, the key point of the ICC has always been that it is the last resort, that what you're looking for is for it to be dealt with in the country. And if it's being dealt with in the country, the ICC is not relevant at any point. So that's the pressure that is saying, and if you don't do it, then the ICC comes in. R2P is exactly the same. It is about the responsibility to protect, which rests with the government of the country, and then finally, if not elsewhere, if not there, then elsewhere. And that can start, it absolutely doesn't mean military immediately. Again, as Gareth said, you know, there are plenty of sanctions which can and should be imposed. And so all of those things are ways of taking it forward. Finally, just to say, in a sense, it is just about determination that the ICC, as discussed, and as we all know, it did seem so impossible, and it has achieved, its very creation has achieved marvellous things, and it can achieve truly amazing things in the future. It's now in a moment where it is going in the right direction. Perhaps one could wish it to go faster than it does, but it can. R2P will be the same. Clusters munitions is another one which is something, you know, a treaty is now on the way, which seemed unthinkable only 6 months or a year ago. And that has been partly by persuading governments that if they don't go in this direction, they'll be hugely embarrassed. Actually, it was mostly bluff, because they wouldn't have been very embarrassed if things hadn't gone in that direction. But if you create the expectation, there was a key meeting in Oslo recently which really shifted things forward because people understood that it needed to change. And that, I think, both NGOs but also Heidi's presence here, I think, is important. How NGOs and friendly governments can work together is both fascinating and powerful. It's one of the biggest changes, one of several changes, but from journalism to NGO work, in some ways I feel I'm doing the same work. I'm trying to highlight the issues I wanted to highlight as a journalist. But as a journalist, you're not part of a strategy. Your strategy is just put it on the front page, and if you do that often enough, if you're lucky, governments may react, as of course they do, as I find from the NGO side. Absolutely, journalists are our key allies on key issues. But you don't really strategize. You just do what you do, and you do it as best you think you're able to. With NGO, civil society, and with governments who want these things to work, that strategizing can really work, and I think this conference is an enormously important place where some of that can go forward. So thank you.
Can I see a show of hands of how many people are planning on asking questions when we come to the Q&A period? Okay. I think we can still go forward with the idea of follow-on remarks from the panelists of a dialogical nature in response to one another before we do open it up to Q&A. So who would like to begin? Ramesh.
Just three things. First, there's been mention of, will this not open up Pandora's box in terms of the scope for abuse as a concern? I think it's worth remembering that interventions happened before R2P was developed as a norm. So clearly the scope for abuse is there independently of this. What R2P does is to change the balance of calculations, hopefully for the better in terms of doing it when necessary, when required, and doing it right and properly, as opposed to without any rules. A second, the point about the Secretary General and the new Secretary General. I think amongst many very impressive traits, one particular genius of Kofi Annan was the way he managed to convert ideational and normative transformations in the world into new institutional linkages in the UN system. I think you are right in your sense that that era of normative entrepreneurship by the Secretary General is not going to be repeated with his successor. I hope I'm wrong, but I suspect your conclusion is right on that.
I was careful to say I didn't actually think it. I hope it won't be true.
I'm just filling in that blank. Third, I would like to make much more explicit, again, something that has been in the background. We stayed away from this in our report because we didn't want to confuse the issues by going and trying to solve all the world's problems. But the high-level panel and the Secretary General's report in Larger Freedom came back to it. I don't think we are going to have a world of effective action by the Security Council until the Security Council is reformed in composition and procedures. It just does not have the legitimacy anymore. Its legitimacy is declining and eroding very rapidly for a whole series of reasons that you will be familiar with. I don't think you can separate the issue anymore. One will be held hostage to the other.
Great. I'll just make one point, actually, also on the Secretary General, whose arrival we greatly anticipated, and perhaps with a rational exuberance. But in any case, it strikes me that, as others have described, the Secretary General has three functions at the UN. He can take the secular pope function that Kofi Annan exemplified, or the chief diplomat role, or the manager. He's got to do all three, and he's got to balance those needs against one another. One of the striking things being in New York right now is that we've been through a very intense period of norm building work over the last decade. We're now in a norm consolidation phase in many cases, and a norm implementation phase, and at the same time we're confronted by what is a deteriorating global security environment. You have two nuclear crises on the Council's agenda, a nuclear proliferation crisis on the Council's agenda, as well as a range of humanitarian crises and very big political developments, including in the Middle East over the summer. So the diplomat role, it may very well prove to be an important function for him, and more important than his predecessor. So I'll just make that point, but that there's also a lot that can be done just at slightly lower levels in the UN Secretariat, and it'll be very important to work those angles as well. One other point, NGOs and friendly governments, Steve, I thought that was something that I very much agreed with in your comments, and our experience on R2P working with Gareth and Ramesh and others has been Bill Pace, who's been a big part of the follow-up work, is that actually you can't do this kind of thinking and this kind of entrepreneurial foreign policy without having that partnership. So it's one that we very much value and endorse wholeheartedly. Thank you.
Almost everything that I've said to you, I've been told by the NGOs and the United Nations, the people that have been associated with the United Nations, can't happen. That you can't move from political and military solutions to a legal and enforcement process. Since I don't belong to any of those organizations and I'm just a businessman, I don't know that those things can't be done. I looked at this as if we were redesigning the perfect system for moral clarity. And it is very clear to me that military solutions to these ad hoc events that happen once every 10 years will not work in the future. The former head of the British forces in NATO, General Smith, has said that the industrial model of military intervention just won't work, and that most of the wars now will be fought, as he calls it, amongst the people. And because that is an entirely different model, none of the military control and command situations, as you saw last night when General Dallaire showed you that there were 5 different command posts that were involved in the Gulf War. That won't work in in a situation where the war is amongst the people, and that's what these genocides are. The command and control system must be at the Security Council level through something like an international marshal service, where all of these things are thought through by the good offices of the NGOs like the International Crisis Group, where we know who and where we have to intervene. You don't intervene between two opposing forces and send in a third force. You go after the head of state in the capital. He's the one that's responsible. The people that he is marshaling are as innocent as the people that we are trying to protect. And it's about time that those people realize that we're going after them, him, whoever he is. And I can't tell you how strongly I feel about this, but the head of state, for the most part, is the culprit. We have held our leaders in the past, Richard Nixon, not to be above the law. And I think that the international community and the global rule of law can be built around the responsibility to protect doctrine.
Well, you get the last word again.
I spoke last already, so I think I would be happy to hear the question.
Okay. All right, so questions, please, and if you would, keep your embellishments to the minimum as you frame your questions in order to allow the maximum number. Yes, sir.
Well, given that the United Nations has this important role and our present presidency holds the United Nations in a very poor, low regard, as exemplified by John Bolton, the former ambassador, do you really expect with this presidency that the United States will be fully behind this new program and will be...
Well, this is a doctrine for all time. Just as the Ten Commandments, when Moses came down and gave people 10 don'ts, you know, they weren't well received, but yet 3 great religions and the rule of law came from the Ten Commandments. So I'm looking past this administration, although they were the ones that did pass and enabled the responsibility to protect to get through the UN. George Bush is not given credit for it by the New York Times, and he won't be remembered in history for doing that any more than Richard Nixon will be remembered for being the one that passed the Environmental Protection Agency. They would rather not, have their constituents know that. Now, I'd like to say one other thing about that. I'm a Republican. I'm a Republican conservative. This doctrine is this is the ultimate right to life movement for the world. Every person that's born on the face of the planet has a right to life under this doctrine, to not be persecuted by his own head of state. So this is an incredibly conservative doctrine. And I ran for governor of Illinois with Ronald Reagan in 1976. So my credentials as a conservative are not to be questioned by, I won't allow them to be questioned by anybody. So this is the last place in the world that I thought I would find a revival of my American spirit was the United Nations. But the United Nations is reforming itself to adapt to the new globalization process, and it deserves a second chance. Not only that, there's a piece that is part of the World Summit outcome that nobody has discussed and nobody has had a conference on, and that is democracy. They also adopted democracy as the governance principle of the world. That's amazing. So the United Nations is recognizing that we all have to play in the same sandbox with the same rules. And I'm just trying to take the next step of that doctrine to say the rules should be the rule of law. That's what makes America great, is that no person is different than anybody else in the eyes of the law. And there's no reason that the global community shouldn't address that issue the same way that America has.
Perhaps one other possible response.
Only very briefly, just to say, I mean, certainly there are, within the US administration, there are those who are acutely, very sympathetic to the ideas. And flagging back, in a sense, partly what I've been saying earlier, but also going back to Gareth Evans' phrase of the false friends, I think one of the difficulties will be, we're very pleased if Washington is supportive, as it partly is, but actually if this became like a Washington initiative, that could in fact backfire. I mean, the idea has to be that everyone is working with it together, basically. So I think there are certainly reasons for hope on both sides, I would say.
Okay, we're entertaining questions again. In the back. Yes.
In northern Uganda, people have been forcibly displaced for over 10 years. And so I would like to know, what would R2P do for people in Uganda who are on the ground, who do not have a voice? Who do they go to? Who do they lobby?
Did you hear the specific reference? Yes.
I think, go back to what Gareth was saying earlier. R2P, one of the strengths of that is that it expands the spectrum of international responses under the overarching doctrine of responsibility, from conflict prevention, through a range of measures, even when reacting, to rebuilding afterwards. So let's not just think of in extremis military intervention as the only thing we are talking about. And what it does is normatively it underlines the responsibility we have as the brothers, as the keepers of all our brothers and sisters, regardless of nationality, religion, gender, etc., and then identify the appropriate response from a very broad range of policy tools that are relevant to that. And there, I think you can look at details, but this is not the place for that.
Anyone else?
Yes, sure. My government has said for the last few years that Northern Uganda belongs on the Security Council's agenda, and we continue to believe that, although the progress that's been made in the diplomatic negotiations has been surprising and very hopeful, I think. You can't actually persuade parties that they need to get serious about negotiations and resolution of perpetration of crimes and the political situation on the ground conflict unless they are persuaded that the international community takes those crimes, that conflict seriously enough to talk about it around the horseshoe of the Security Council. And so I think that's one thing that R2P does for crises like Northern Uganda. It squarely situates the responsibility for at least discussing political resolution of the crises in the body with the authority to make decisions that are binding. Thank you.
Next, please.
A major drawback that I see from the R2P paradigm is that it kind of focuses on protection, and it seems to stop short of asking the question why, like why genocide happened in the first place and what are the underlying issues. And taking Darfur as an example, I think that we saw this come up last year with the peace agreement in May 5th. And I visited Darfur right after that, and people they showed that the issue of stopping direct violence wasn't enough. I mean, they needed political and economic justice, and people across Darfur, popularly support these movements that are fighting with the government. That a lot of this framework seems to say, the core issue is to get these two groups to stop fighting, but they're kind of in support of these groups because they're addressing the political and economic issues. So I'm wondering where that kind of stuff fits into this framework.
Well, thank you. It does fit in, and it goes back to the two accompanying responsibilities, to prevent and then to rebuild as well. And you're not going to get very far in either side if you ignore issues of justice and equity and power sharing arrangements and all that. So that part is there. Having said that, I'd like to just emphasize caution. R2P is not a cure-all panacea for all the problems that we have in the world. Even if you have acceptance of the norm and movement from principle into practical action as and when required, there will still be a whole range of additional policy tools that we will need to carry on with life and governance, both domestically and internationally. I think it would be dangerous if R2P started being extended and broadened to try and cover everything, because that, I think, would destroy what, in my view, has always been the great merit of its essence, that we resisted the temptation not to try and solve all the world's problems through one doctrine.
Yeah. Just echoing what Ramesh has said, I think that sometimes less can be more. Clearly the issues that you address are really important and they need to be looked at and for ways of moving forward. But actually, in terms of what's happening and has been happening on Darfur, you've got some really basic stuff, even if you step back from the root issues which need to be addressed. However big those problems are on either side, you had then and you have the killing of civilians, rape, ethnic cleansing, vast numbers of people being driven out of their homes in such a way that it would be absolutely impossible for them to return. All of those things simply need to be stopped, whatever the other problems are, and can be done. And it was extraordinary for me when arriving at Human Rights Watch. I arrived in 2002. By 2003, Darfur was to some extent on the agenda. By the beginning of 2004, every NGO, every serious NGO in the world, and certainly in UK where I was working, we were having weekly meetings about the horrors of what was happening in Darfur and trying to work out. We all knew, the Foreign Office knew, other governments knew. It really wasn't a secret. There's a word, early warning, which is often used, and clearly early warning is important. But I keep throwing that word back in politicians' faces because I had a Downing Street mission that came to look at the lessons of Darfur and early warning. And I said, don't talk to me about early warning. It was so obvious what was happening, and you didn't want to take any reaction at all. And so even journalists, and it was very interesting for me to find how journalists as well were initially very reluctant. They went, yeah, but Steve, you know, all this other stuff that's going on in Iraq, and there's Abu Ghraib, and there's this, and that, and our budgets are gone, and we really haven't got time. And you would say again and again, but don't you see how horrific this is? Yeah, but, you know, whatever. And if it wasn't on somebody else's front pages, it doesn't need to be on mine. We finally, I say we, I mean Human Rights Watch, we played a role, but many other NGOs and, you know, there were others who did it. But frankly, that's something which R2P, when working well, if properly operationalized, will confront of you can't simply step back from horrors of the working. And you don't wait for journalists to put it on the front page. Because frankly, speaking as a former journalist, and still, if you like, a journalist in my head, journalists also react to what is considered to be important. It's very difficult for one individual journalist to change stuff, though sometimes it happens. So I do think less is more is important. That it's really, if we manage to clock that one, if we manage to react to stuff which is clearly on the horizon, General Dallaire's story on that obviously is so powerful that well before the genocide itself had started, the signs were really, really obvious, and people didn't want to listen. I think that, God knows, is a large enough challenge, and I think if we stick with that and manage to crack it, then we'll have moved things forward.
Yes.
Charlie Brown, Citizens for Global Solutions. Two quick, I'll try to make them quick questions. The first one is, both Heidi and Steve talked about the challenges of getting the norm to be embraced by those who've already theoretically adopted it. And I would make the point that it's not just a rearguard action that has certain governments attacking R2P. It's the failure of other governments to come forward and take a leadership role in advocating R2P. I was at a conference a couple weeks ago of the Community of Democracies in Rome with about 20 governments present. I raised the point that the UN Democracy Caucus should be taking a leadership role in R2P. And most of the governments, which are represented at the deputy foreign minister level, had no clue what R2P was. So there's an educational issue here. These are not people who shouldn't know. They're people who should know. Second quick point is, both you, Steve, and Gareth earlier talked about how R2P has been embraced by both the US and UK as an excuse for Iraq. But there's a flip side here, and that is everybody in the US is talking about when's the US going to get out. Very few people are talking about what happens after the US gets out. And I would argue, as a devil's advocate, that there is an R2P frame in Iraq, but it isn't how we got in, it's what happens after the US gets out. And what is the international community's responsibility to protect the Iraqi citizens?
I'll take the first one, and I'm leaving the second one for Steve. I've often been frustrated at the amount of advocacy that we have to do to raise the even basic awareness amongst colleagues in New York and in capitals of R2P. These things bear repeating over and over and over again, and probably will be the same for another 10, 15 years. And first, to make people aware of these ideas and the need and the potential solution, and second, to overcome the very legitimate political concerns that arise when we talk about R2P. But a long time. My government has been spending approximately $1 million a year since R2P was published to staff a unit that does nothing but think about how to promote R2P in the world and funds conferences and undertakes missions, etc. And 5 years of that is not yet enough to overcome what you're describing. So it's just I thank you for the question. It'll take a long time and a lot of commitment.
And thank you for passing that. Because it is clearly an incredibly tough question, it's an incredibly important question, and the kind of the natural instinct, there may be an American equivalent of this phrase, but the one on the other side of the Atlantic, how do I get to Ballymurphy? Well, if you want to get to Ballymurphy, you shouldn't start from here. And it is tempting to kind of rebut any difficult question with Iraq saying, well, various of those things shouldn't happen. And to be honest, in a way, I am still going to do that. I mean, to take your question direct, if let's just put history right into a box for a moment and say, this is where we are now, and now get to Ballymurphy, some kind of stability for Iraq, then the work on rebuilding is enormously important. It cannot be overstated, and for all the obvious reasons, all of us, meaning all countries, I mean the United States, yes, as well, but other countries as well bear responsibility. But again, I do think that one should also look, that's one of the problems of Iraq, it's entangled so many issues, is that in practical terms it has complicated R2P's life because of the way that it has been presented, as it were. So that, but as regards to rebuilding, yes, you're absolutely right.
Okay, and just two comments to that as well, as a UN official, if you like. Firstly, I think the United Nations is the only body that has the capacity to mobilize necessary resources for the nation-building tasks that will be required, and the legitimacy to authorize any nation-building operation that will be required also. So I think the implication of what the question you asked is absolutely correct. Having said that, there is the problem of a double moral hazard. The first one is this. I have problems with an argument that regardless of the merits or justification of original intervention, the very fact of having intervened now gives us a responsibility to stay on. In other words, the fact of intervention is justification for continuing role as occupiers. There is a moral hazard problem there. Second one, the United Nations is already in great difficulty in many parts of the world in being seen as the after-sales service provider for the mess created by the United States. We need to be careful of that also, that we are not always seen as, well, the others go in with military forces and then we are left there to pick up the pieces, and we just have no option but to go and do that.
General Dallaire, you have the last question.
I'm still left a bit confused on the Office of Primary Interest now with R2P within the international community or the UN. We spoke of the different departments who own it and fiddle with it. Ultimately, who's really moving the doctrine now to the next phase? Is there a center that has that mandate to do so, or are we waiting for another country to take the lead and launch the second phase of this activity?
Well, if I may, I'll give you an idea that came out of a discussion that I had with David Hamburg, and that is to form a commission of former foreign ministers of the United Nations to address just that issue as part of how the United Nations adapts to R2P. So that's very much, I mean, the United Nations is certainly central to this successful resolution. And R2P, the genocide crimes are a unique situation. It's kind of like a one-off. It's not a war. This is about our common humanity. And I think I would like to get as many ideas as I can about that from, he knows I'm going to impose upon him, Mr. Evans, to help us put that together. But we're trying to engage the United Nations to think on a new level about that too. I want to move this platform from mutually assured destruction, which is what intervention would be, to an enforcement mechanism which assures mutually assured diplomacy. And that's the new paradigm, from one kind of mad to another kind of mad. But I think that we can do it. I think the will is there. I'll just give you a little update on how quickly this is happening. 2 weeks ago Tuesday, I had lunch with Senator Kennedy, and I discussed re-energizing the International Criminal Court movement in the Judiciary Committee. I met with Chuck Schumer, Dick Durbin, and Jim Webb, who's the new senator from Virginia. They are all very interested in this. Americans are hungry for new ideas and solving problems now. And they are interested in forming little committees in the Congress that would issue reports on how America could be engaged. So it is happening. R2P is like the fine hand in business. It is a self-organizing principle that once people hear of it and they know of it, they feel that there's something they can, that they can add to it. So I'm very, very optimistic. I have real hope that we can relegate this to a crime and to a justice solution.
I might take a run at the General's question as well. General, there's a lot of work going on in New York right now. Is there a focal point and a driver for that work? Not as much as you would like there to be. I think that's one of the critical things as this new Secretary General describes and makes choices about the genocide prevention architecture at the UN. A critical question will be who coordinates across the many bodies of the UN who have a piece of this action. In order for R2P to be fully implemented, you need a lot to go right in the Department of Peacekeeping Operations, in the Office of the Humanitarian Coordinator, in the Department of Political Affairs, and in monitoring and advocacy generally. My personal reflection on this is that the best model would be not unlike what they've done on peace building in the UN. You have an office that's fairly senior, special advisor to the ASG rather than special advisor, but with a specific mandate to coordinate across the system. We need to be able to pull together those parts that need to be talking to one another, and so we think that is an absolutely critical issue going forward. In the meantime, a few like-minded governments are working with the different parts of the system to try to think through, okay, what does DPA have to do in order to operationalize R2P? What does DPKO have to do to operationalize R2P? So there is some of that work going on. We'd like it to be led within the UN system itself, but in the meantime, we're happy to help along the way.
Just echoing that, I mean, you, of course, know better, to be honest, than anybody else in the world, the difficulties that there can and have been where where authority is bedded just within in one place, and it then runs into the sand. I mean, the story of the problems that you had to confront are an enormously important lesson for us all, I think we look at in terms of R2P. The list of some of the bodies where it will be, Heidi has listed, that awful word mainstreaming, it is one of my least favourite words, but in a sense, the sense of it all being integrated, I think, is extraordinarily important. And it just gives me the opportunity to mention, which is at a sidestep, something I meant to mention earlier, the Human Rights Council, and which is not where these things will be led from as such, because I think it is New York, I think it's Security Council, also the engagement of the Secretary General. But just to flag for those who hadn't clocked, an enormously important piece of good news in recent days for R2P is the Human Rights Council mission that has just come back and reported on Darfur. And a thread of their highly critical, rightly hard-hitting report was R2P going through that. And I think it's been very important that he's now out there saying this is something which stands for what is happening, and that the Human Rights Council's role will also be one. But I think those different bodies working together, and if any of them, coming back to my turf point earlier, if any of them tries to say, oh, this belongs to us and not to the others, I think that actually rolls it back. Right. Yeah.
Well, you're to be commended for your germane yet succinct questions. The noon bells have just rung. And a rarity in Berkeley has occurred. We're on time. So keep in mind that we commence again at 1:30 with R2P and international versus national policy initiatives. And I would certainly like to thank the panel for their insightful remarks.